At my own son's birthday party, I saw a photo of myself and my new husband taped to the glass entrance of the ballroom. Underneath it, in bold black letters, were the words, "Not welcome inside." For a moment, the music from the orchestra faded, the chatter of wealthy guests dissolved into a distant hum, and all I could see was my own smiling face on that photograph, smiling beside the man I chose to love after 10 years of widowhood, labeled like an inconvenience. Daniel squeezed my hand. His fingers were rough, steady, protective. He didn't speak, but I could feel the question in his grip. "Do you want me to tear it down?" Instead, I smiled, not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because silence is not weakness. It is preparation. Before I tell you what happened 2 hours later, before I tell you what was inside the gift we left in the hall that made my son's expression freeze in front of 200 people, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Some lessons are learned late in life, but they are worth learning well. It was 6:45 p.m. when Daniel and I arrived at the Grand Meridian Hotel, the kind of place where chandeliers drip crystal like rain and the carpet is so thick it swallows the sound of footsteps. Julian's 38th birthday was less a party and more a performance. Valets lined the entrance. Imported cars glided up one after another. Women in silk gowns stepped out carefully, lifting hems so they wouldn't brush the pavement. Men adjusted cufflinks that cost more than our monthly grocery bill. Daniel parked our aging sedan 2 blocks away without complaint. He wore his navy suit, the only one he owned, pressed carefully that afternoon. I wore a deep emerald dress I'd had tailored twice over the years. It wasn't designer, but it fit me well. Dignity does not require a label. As we climbed the hotel steps, I heard laughter through the glass doors, the clink of champagne flutes, the low hum of live strings. Julian had always loved appearances. Even as a child, he lined up his toy cars in perfect order. He wanted things to look impressive, even when we had very little. I taught him discipline. His father, Robert Lawson, taught him structure. But somewhere along the way, structure turned into image and image turned into obsession. And then I saw the photograph. It was from 6 months ago. Daniel's arm was around my shoulders. We were visiting Julian's office for the first time after our wedding. I remember that day clearly, Julian's polite smile stretched thin, Victoria's eyes scanning Daniel's worn shoes. The picture must have been pulled from social media. Enlarged, laminated, displayed like a warning, "Not welcome inside." The 2 security guards glanced at us, then at the sign. One tried to hide a smirk. Guests slowed as they approached the entrance. Some whispered. One woman tilted her head and said, "Oh, that's awkward," before slipping inside. My son, my only child. The boy I stayed up nights studying accounting regulations for so I could help him with his first business plan. The young man whose college tuition I supplemented quietly by liquidating a portion of Robert's retirement account. The man who now built glass towers and hosted champagne galas had decided that his mother and her mechanic husband were bad for the brand. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Mara," he murmured softly, "say the word." I looked at the sign again. I let the sting settle, then I exhaled slowly. "No," I said calmly. "We won't embarrass him, because humiliation is loud. Strategy is quiet." I reached into my handbag and removed a silver-wrapped box, rectangular, modest in size, 12 inches long, neatly tied with a burgundy ribbon. Daniel glanced at it. "You're still giving it to him?" he asked. I nodded. "Especially now?" He didn't know what was inside. No one did except Henry Caldwell, our family attorney, who had prepared certain documents at my request 3 years ago, documents Julian had never thought to ask about. I approached the security guard with the smirk. "Would you please see that this is delivered to Julian Lawson?" I asked gently. "It's from his mother. Tell him I hope he opens it during the toast." The guard hesitated, then took the box. "We'll see," he muttered. "It's important," I added with a small smile. "He'll understand." Daniel and I turned away before anyone could witness my tears. We walked down the steps slowly, past the red carpet, past the glowing lights, back toward our parked car. I could still feel eyes on us. Laughter, judgment, but something inside me was steady. Because 3 years ago, when Julian first suggested that my marriage to Daniel sent the wrong message, I began preparing for this night. 3 years ago, when Victoria gently implied that my presence at corporate functions confused investors, I revisited the ownership documents Robert and I had structured decades earlier. 3 years ago, I sat across from Henry Caldwell in his quiet office and asked a single question. If perception becomes cruelty, what protections remain? Henry had adjusted his glasses and slid a folder across the desk. More than he realizes, he'd said. Daniel started the engine but didn't drive. Do you want to talk about it? He asked carefully. I watched the hotel entrance in the rearview mirror, guests still streaming in. My photo still taped to the door. Julian believes power is visibility, I said quietly. He thinks control is loud. Tonight he's going to learn the difference. Daniel studied me. He has always respected my silences. That's why I married him, not for wealth, not for status, but for steadiness. Are you sure? He asked. I nodded once. I am. We drove home. Our house was modest. 2 bedrooms, a small garden Daniel tended with patience. The furniture was a mix of old and practical. But it was ours, built on honesty, not image. I set my phone on the coffee table. Henry had arranged for something simple earlier that day, access to the event's livestream. Nothing illegal. The hotel proudly broadcast high-profile gatherings for promotional purposes. Tonight was no exception. We could see the ballroom in full view, chandeliers glowing, tables dressed in ivory, investors seated near the stage. Victoria shimmering in gold. Julian moved through the crowd with polished confidence, shaking hands, laughing easily, performing success. If you had only met him tonight, you would believe he built everything alone. That he rose without scaffolding, that he owed no one anything. The orchestra softened as dinner concluded. Guests leaned back in their chairs, glasses refilled. Julian tapped his champagne flute. The room quieted. To another year of growth, he began smoothly. To vision, resilience, and knowing your worth. Applause followed. Victoria beamed. Cameras flashed. I watched without blinking. Because in less than 20 minutes, the gift in the hallway would reach his hands. And when he opened it, when he unfolded the documents Robert and I structured before Julian ever signed his first contract, when he realized that the majority voting shares of Lawson Development Holdings had never been fully his, when he understood that the silent capital injection made 20 years ago carried conditions he ignored, his expression would change. Not because I wanted revenge, but because boundaries sometimes require demonstration. Daniel squeezed my knee gently. Whatever happens, he said, I'm proud of you. I rested my hand over his. In the ballroom, a waiter approached Julian with the silver box. I saw recognition flicker across my son's face when he read the attached card from Mother. He smirked slightly. He said something to Victoria that made her laugh. He held the box up for the room to see. Apparently, he said into the microphone, even those who aren't attending wanted to send their regards. Laughter rippled across the tables. My chest tightened, but I did not look away. He untied the ribbon slowly, theatrically, removed the wrapping, lifted the lid, and then he stopped smiling. The color drained from his face. The room leaned forward. Victoria whispered something urgently at his side. Julian stared down at the top page, then flipped it. And flipped it again. His fingers began to tremble. 200 guests waited for him to speak. Instead, he looked out across the ballroom as if searching for someone who wasn't there. Because the name printed beneath majority controlling interest was not his. And the clause dated 20 years earlier bore both Robert Lawson's signature and mine. The orchestra players glanced at one another uncertainly. The investors began whispering. Victoria reached for the document, but Julian pulled it back instinctively. For the first time in his adult life, he looked unsure. Daniel exhaled slowly beside me. That's what was in the box? He asked quietly. I nodded. Not destruction, I said. Correction? On the screen, Julian stepped away from the microphone. The celebration had shifted. Something invisible had entered the room. And as I watched my son confront a truth he never expected to see printed in black and white, I realized something important. Sometimes the greatest lesson a mother can give is not protection. It is perspective. And tonight, the party had only just begun. The room did not explode into chaos. It did something far more dangerous. It went quiet. Julian stood at the center of the ballroom, holding papers that were never supposed to see daylight in front of his investors. His jaw was tight. His smile, carefully trained over years of networking, was gone. Victoria leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but he wasn't listening. He was reading the clause again, and again. I knew exactly which line had frozen him. Pursuant to the original capital structuring agreement dated May 14, 20 years prior. Controlling equity of Lawson Development Holdings remains under conditional majority trust authority. That trust authority bore two names: Robert Lawson, Margaret Lawson. The livestream camera shifted slightly, zooming toward the stage as murmurs began to rise across the tables. Investors exchanged glances. A few reached for their phones. One man adjusted his glasses and leaned forward as if he needed to confirm what he was seeing. Julian finally stepped back toward the microphone. "There appears to be a clerical document here," he said carefully. His voice was controlled but thinner than before. "My mother has always enjoyed paperwork." A few nervous laughs scattered across the room, but they were weak. He flipped another page. The next sheet contained the amendment Henry Caldwell and I had executed 3 years ago, activated the moment Julian attempted to restructure ownership without trustee notification. He never noticed the clause because he never imagined I would use it. He believed I was sentimental, not strategic. Victoria's composure began to crack first. She reached for the papers again, this time successfully pulling one free. Her eyes scanned the page quickly. I watched the exact second her posture changed. She understood numbers well enough. 51% voting control, effective immediately upon breach of fiduciary transparency. "Julian," she whispered sharply, though the microphone caught it faintly. "What is this?" Daniel sat beside me in our living room, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the screen. "You didn't tell me it was 51%, he said quietly. "I didn't need to," I replied calmly. "It was never about humiliating him. It was about ensuring he never mistook inheritance for entitlement." In the ballroom, one of the primary investors, Mr. Halpern, stood slowly. "Julian," he called out, not angrily but firmly. "Is there something we need to understand here regarding voting structure?" Julian forced a small smile. "My mother retained a ceremonial stake years ago. It's nothing operational." That was the moment Henry Caldwell stepped into frame. I had not told Daniel Henry would attend, but Henry believed in timing. He moved with deliberate calm through the tables, carrying a leather portfolio. 72 years old and still impeccably composed. He stopped near the stage. "If I may clarify," Henry said evenly, his voice projecting without strain. The microphone was handed to him almost instinctively. Authority recognizes authority. "The controlling trust was never ceremonial," Henry continued. "It was structured as layered asset protection under the late Robert Lawson's guidance." At the mention of Robert's name, something shifted in me. My husband had always believed wealth should be secured in layers: visible ownership, silent oversight, conditional authority. "In simple terms," Henry said, "majority voting rights reside with Mrs. Margaret Lawson until further review of governance compliance." The silence returned heavier now. Victoria's face drained of color. Julian stared at Henry as though seeing him for the first time. "That's not accurate," Julian said quickly. "We updated the structure when we went public on Phase 2 development." Henry adjusted his glasses. "You updated surface allocations. You did not amend foundational trust control." A ripple spread across the ballroom. Investors began murmuring more openly now. One woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, "So he doesn't actually control his own company?" Julian's confidence cracked further. "This is a private matter," he insisted. "My mother is not even present." That line lingered in the air, not present, yet everywhere. In our small living room, Daniel looked at me with quiet admiration. "You never told him," he said softly. "You let him believe he was untouchable." I nodded. "Because I wanted him to learn how he behaved without accountability." And he had shown me. Over the last 3 years, Julian had grown sharper in public and colder in private. Invitations to family dinners declined, calls unanswered, my remarriage treated like a branding inconvenience. Victoria once told me gently over lunch, "High-profile circles are sensitive to optics." Optics, as if love required aesthetic approval. On the screen, Julian stepped off the stage and motioned Henry aside. The livestream audio picked up fragments. "You had no authority to present this tonight. Fiduciary responsibility compels transparency. You blindsided me." "No, Julian." The clause activated itself. Victoria remained on stage, gripping the papers tightly. She scanned the fine print again, slower this time. Investors began approaching her instead of Julian. They wanted clarity. And clarity now had my name attached to it. Daniel leaned back, exhaling. He's not being arrested, he's not ruined, he observed. No, I said, he's being corrected. There is a difference between destroying someone and removing their illusion of control. One is vengeance, the other is structure. Julian returned to the microphone, this time without the earlier polish. It appears, he began carefully, that certain legacy provisions require review. He glanced toward the camera briefly, toward the livestream lens, almost as if he could feel me watching. We will address this internally and ensure continued stability. Stability. He was trying to salvage perception, but perception had shifted. Investors were no longer celebrating. They were calculating. If majority control rested elsewhere, they needed to reassess alliances. Victoria stepped forward beside him. Her voice was smoother than his now. Ladies and gentlemen, she said with professional ease, governance transitions are not uncommon in family-founded firms. This is procedural. She smiled beautifully, but her eyes flickered. She had built her identity around Julian's dominance, and dominance had just been redefined. Henry closed his portfolio calmly and stepped back from the stage. His job was done. The documents were public. The truth was visible, nothing illegal, nothing scandalous, just structural reality. The orchestra attempted to resume playing, but the melody felt misplaced. Conversations resumed in low tones. Some guests began leaving quietly, others stayed, sensing that something foundational had shifted. Daniel muted the television. The room felt still. How long have you been preparing this? He asked. Since the day Julian told me my marriage was an embarrassment to his brand, I answered honestly. Not in anger, in clarity. That day I revisited every document Robert and I had signed 20 years earlier. I remembered Robert's voice. Never transfer power without protection. I didn't act immediately, I observed. I watched how Julian treated employees, how he spoke about legacy as though he alone built it, how he distanced himself from anything that looked humble. And tonight, when he taped my photograph to a ballroom door, he crossed a line he didn't realize was drawn in ink decades ago. Daniel reached for my hand. Do you think he'll call? I looked at the silent phone on the coffee table. Not tonight, I said. Tonight he's still angry. Anger is the first stage when illusion collapses. Accountability comes later if it comes at all. Back at the hotel, the livestream showed Julian and Victoria stepping into a private side room with Henry and two investors. The party continued in fragments outside, but the celebration was fractured. Julian's birthday would now be remembered for something else entirely. Daniel turned the television off completely. You taught him something tonight, he said gently. I hope so, I replied, because this was never about reclaiming power for myself. I have no interest in running his company. I am 69 years old. I wanted peace, not position. But I will not allow my dignity to be reduced to optics. I will not allow silence to be mistaken for ignorance. Silence is not weakness. It is preparation. And tonight, the first layer had been revealed. But what Julian didn't yet understand, what Victoria hadn't read far enough to see, was that the trust documents contained one more condition. One that would require a decision from him before the month was over. And that decision would determine whether he lost only control or something far more personal. Julian did call, not that night, but at 6:12 the next morning. I was already awake. I've never slept late, not even when I had the luxury to. Discipline becomes habit after decades of survival. The phone vibrated on the kitchen table while I was pouring hot water into 2 cups of tea. Daniel looked up from the newspaper. He didn't ask who it was, he already knew. I let it ring twice more before answering. Good morning, Julian. Silence on the other end, then a controlled breath. What did you do? His voice wasn't loud, it was tight. Restrained anger layered over disbelief. I stirred my tea slowly. I honored the agreement your father and I signed 20 years ago. You blindsided me in front of investors, in front of my board. No, I corrected calmly. You blindsided yourself when you assumed ownership meant immunity. He exhaled sharply. This is about that ridiculous sign at the door, isn't it? I smiled faintly. He still believed this was emotional retaliation. That was the problem. Julian measured every action by ego. The sign was your choice, I said. The documents were mine. Silence again, longer this time. You could have talked to me privately. I tried. 3 years ago, you said my marriage was damaging to your image. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. Grounded, present, not threatened, I continued. You didn't want a conversation, Julian, you wanted distance. His tone shifted slightly. So what now, you take over my company? There it was, fear disguised as sarcasm. It was never yours alone, I replied evenly, and I have no interest in operating it. But majority voting rights require governance review. That review begins this week. He laughed once bitterly. You think investors will trust you over me? They already are. That silence was different, not anger, calculation. He knew I was right. Henry Caldwell had spent the morning answering calls from two primary stakeholders requesting clarification on oversight structure. Investors prefer stability over personality. They trust documentation more than charisma. There's another clause, I said finally. I could almost hear his posture change on the other end of the line. What clause? You should read the amendment in full. I read it. You skimmed it? A pause, longer, slower breathing now. What are you talking about? I looked out the kitchen window at Daniel's garden. The morning light touched the roses he planted last spring. Robert used to say contracts are conversations in writing, and conversations deserve attention. The trust contains a behavioral governance provision, I explained calmly, activated in cases of reputational risk tied to executive conduct. Reputational risk? His voice sharpened. I run a clean operation. This isn't about legality, I said. It's about leadership ethics. Daniel watched me carefully but didn't interrupt. He had learned something important about me over the years. When I am quiet, I am thinking. When I speak slowly, I am certain. Spell it out, Julian demanded. Within 30 days of trust activation, I continued, the acting executive must agree to a formal review of executive conduct and corporate culture. That includes board evaluation, employee retention metrics, vendor relationship audits, and public representation standards. He scoffed. That's standard compliance. Yes, I agreed, but this time it is conducted independently. With trustee authority, silence, and then he understood, you're evaluating me. The position, I corrected, not the person. That's a lie. His voice rose slightly. This is personal. I let the words hang between us. It would have been easy to argue, to list every dismissive comment, every condescending glance Victoria had offered, every time I was excluded from an event because I didn't fit the aesthetic. But this wasn't about emotion. It was about pattern. Leadership reveals character, I said quietly, and character shapes companies. Daniel stood and refilled my cup without being asked. The gesture was small but steady. Julian lowered his voice again. If I refuse, there it was. The real question? I closed my eyes briefly, remembering Robert's voice the day we first structured Lawson Development Holdings. Power without accountability corrupts lineage, he'd said. Build layers. If you refuse, I answered evenly, the trust mandates temporary suspension of executive authority pending board vote. His breath caught. You'd remove me from my own company? It isn't removal. It's review. That's the same thing. No, I said gently. Removal is permanent, review is opportunity. He didn't respond immediately. I imagined him pacing, jaw tight, pride wounded more deeply than control. Julian built his identity on perception. If perception cracked, so did he. Investors won't support this, he said finally. They prefer performance. Investors prefer predictability, I corrected. And stability. Another long pause. Then softer, almost reluctant. Why now? I considered that carefully, because that was the question beneath everything. Why expose structural control tonight? Why choose public revelation? I could have activated the clause quietly months ago, but quiet correction doesn't always penetrate inflated ego. Because last night, I said calmly, you decided I was small enough to tape to a door. He didn't argue that. Instead, he whispered something unexpected. Victoria said it would be funny. There it was, the insecurity beneath ambition, the need for approval. And you agreed, I replied. You're a grown man, Julian. Silence again. But this time it wasn't defensive. It was reflective. Daniel sat back down beside me. He looked proud, not because I was overpowering my son, but because I was composed. There is a difference between anger and authority. What do you want from me? Julian finally asked. I hadn't expected him to ask that so soon. I want you to understand that respect is not decorative, I said. It is structural. The way you treat people, your mother included, becomes part of your leadership DNA. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was lower. So I agree to the review. And then what? Then we see what the evaluation reveals. And if I pass, I allowed myself a small breath. Then majority voting rights transition back to you in phased increments over 5 years. He froze. 5 years, trust is rebuilt gradually, I replied. So is control. He let out a slow breath. You've thought through every angle, for a long time. Daniel stood and stepped outside to tend the garden, giving me privacy. Julian spoke again, but this time there was no edge in his tone. Did Dad know you'd do this? That question pierced differently. I looked toward the framed photo of Robert on the living room shelf. Your father believed in protection, I said softly. He believed in you, but he also believed in guardrails. Julian's voice thinned. He trusted me. He prepared you, I corrected. Preparation isn't distrust, it's wisdom. Silence. Longer now, but not hostile. I sensed something shifting beneath the pride. Victoria won't like this, he muttered finally. I didn't comment on that. A marriage built on image rarely welcomes accountability. You have 30 days, I said gently. After that, the board will vote on interim leadership if necessary. He exhaled slowly. You always said silence was preparation. It still is. The line went quiet. I'll review the documents again, he said finally. Good, I replied. And Julian? A pause. Yes. The sign on the door hurt, but not because of the words, because of what it revealed. He didn't ask what it revealed, he already knew. We ended the call without saying goodbye. Daniel came back inside moments later. How did it go? He asked. He's thinking, I said. Daniel smiled gently. That's new. I nodded. Yes. It is. Later that afternoon, Henry Caldwell called with updates. 2 investors had formally requested governance review transparency. The board was unsettled but not panicked. Stability had not collapsed, it had shifted. He didn't read the full amendment, Henry observed calmly. Most executives don't, I said. They assume the foundation matches the facade. Henry chuckled softly. You and Robert built a strong foundation? After we hung up, I stood in the living room alone for a moment. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady, because this was never about revenge. It was about interruption. Interrupting arrogance before it calcifies. Interrupting generational drift before it becomes legacy. That evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch watching the sun lower behind the trees. Do you think he'll choose the review? Daniel asked quietly. I watched the sky change colors. He will, I said, because for the first time in his adult life he understands that image alone cannot save him. Daniel nodded. And if he doesn't, I looked toward the horizon, then he'll learn a different lesson. Inside, my phone lit up with a notification, a message from Victoria, short, polished, calculated. Margaret, we need to talk. I did not respond immediately, because conversation, like power, is most effective when timed correctly, and Victoria had just realized something important. The sign on the door was not the most expensive decision she made that night. Victoria didn't wait long. By the next morning, her message had turned into a call. I let it ring once before answering. Margaret, she began smoothly, her voice polished as ever, I think we should meet privately. There seems to be a misunderstanding. I almost smiled. A misunderstanding is what people call it when they realize the power dynamic isn't what they assumed. There's no misunderstanding, I replied calmly. But we can meet. We agreed on a quiet cafe downtown, neutral territory. Daniel offered to come, but I shook my head. This isn't confrontation, I told him. It's clarification? He nodded, trusting me the way he always did. When I arrived, Victoria was already seated by the window, impeccably dressed, cream blazer, gold watch, hair perfectly styled. She looked composed, but I've spent 40 years reading compliance signals, microexpressions, posture shifts, breathing changes. She was unsettled. Margaret, she said, standing halfway, offering a polite air kiss that didn't land. Thank you for coming. Of course, I replied, sitting across from her. She folded her hands neatly on the table. Julian is under a great deal of pressure right now. I stirred my coffee slowly. Leadership tends to come with that, she inhaled gently. The way this was handled publicly has created unnecessary instability. The instability existed before, I said evenly. It just wasn't visible. Her jaw tightened slightly. She wasn't used to resistance delivered without emotion. You could have called a board meeting quietly, she continued. You chose spectacle. I held her gaze. Your husband chose spectacle when he taped my photograph to a door. She looked down briefly, not ashamed, strategizing. That was meant to be lighthearted, she said carefully. Humor can misfire. Humor requires mutual respect, I replied. It wasn't misfire, it was message. She shifted in her seat. The cafe noise around us felt distant, like background static. Julian feels betrayed, she said finally. He trusted that the company structure reflected his growth. Growth doesn't erase origin, I said. The structure reflected foresight. Her tone sharpened slightly. You're putting everything at risk. Investors value decisiveness. They value governance more. She leaned forward now, lowering her voice. What exactly do you want? There it was again, the assumption that everything has a price or demand attached. I considered her carefully before answering. I want Julian to complete the executive review, I said, fully, transparently. She exhaled slowly. And if he does, control transitions back over time. She blinked. Over 5 years, so she had read the clause thoroughly. Good, yes. That timeline will signal weakness, she argued. It signals maturity, I corrected. She studied me differently now, not dismissively, but analytically. You've been planning this for years. I've been prepared for years. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Julian built that company. I let a small silence sit between us before responding. Julian built expansion. Robert built foundation. I maintained structure. She didn't like that answer. It diluted the myth she curated, the self-made visionary narrative. Optics matter, she insisted. Reputation shapes valuation. Character shapes longevity, I replied calmly. Her composure cracked slightly then. You think I care only about image? I tilted my head slightly. You care deeply about image. She sat back, defensive now, because perception drives opportunity. Only until truth surfaces, I said. The tension between us wasn't loud, it was layered. Victoria thrived in curated environments, events, campaigns, press features, but this wasn't an environment she could style. Julian won't remove himself, she said finally. He won't step aside for review voluntarily. I folded my hands. Then the board will enforce it. Her eyes narrowed. You would actually suspend your own son? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I remembered Robert sitting at our dining table 22 years ago explaining layered control. Love does not eliminate accountability, he had said. If anything, it demands it. I returned to the present. If necessary, I said quietly. Victoria looked away toward the cafe window. Cars passed outside. People moved freely. She looked smaller in that moment, not physically, but strategically. You don't understand what it took for him to be taken seriously, she said softly. He fought to be seen as more than a legacy kid. That surprised me. There was something real in her voice. And taping my photograph to a door helped that? I asked gently. She didn't respond, because she knew it didn't. It exposed insecurity instead. Julian fears losing control, she admitted finally. Control was never fully his, I replied. That's what frightens him. She looked back at me. And what frightens you? The question was unexpected, honest. I didn't deflect it. Watching him confuse dominance with strength, I said quietly. Watching him forget humility. She studied me more carefully now, less adversary, more evaluation. If he completes the review, she asked slowly, and the findings are clean, you will honor the transition? Absolutely, I said without hesitation. This isn't about holding power, it's about ensuring he deserves it. She sat with that. Silence stretched between us. Finally, she nodded once. I'll convince him? You don't need to convince him, I said. He needs to choose it. That distinction matters. When accountability is forced, it breeds resentment. When it's chosen, it builds character. Victoria stood slowly. You realize, she said, gathering her purse, this changes everything. I looked up at her calmly. It already has. After she left, I remained seated for several minutes, not because I was shaken, but because I was reflecting. Daniel always says strength isn't about volume, it's about steadiness. And steady is what I felt. Later that evening, Julian called again. This time his voice carried less fire. I spoke with the board, he said, and they want the review. Good. A pause. Victoria says it's strategic. I smiled faintly. Of course she framed it that way. It is, I agreed. Strategic growth. Another silence, but this one wasn't hostile, it was thoughtful. I don't like feeling exposed, he admitted quietly. That was the most honest sentence he had spoken in days. Exposure reveals foundation, I said. If it's strong, nothing collapses. He breathed out slowly. Henry's coordinating the independent auditors? Yes, 30 days, 30 days. And during that time, he asked carefully. Shared oversight, I replied. You're not alone, you're supervised. He didn't argue, that told me more than words could. After we ended the call, Daniel looked at me from across the living room. Progress? He asked. I nodded. Yes, he smiled warmly. You didn't destroy him. That was never the goal. That night, as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I thought about something important. Many women are taught to shrink when disrespected, to absorb humiliation quietly for the sake of peace. But peace built on self-erasure is not peace, it's surrender. Silence is not weakness, it is preparation. And preparation, when finally revealed, doesn't scream, it stands. The executive review would begin in 72 hours. And what it uncovered, about Julian, about leadership culture, about the company he believed he fully controlled, would determine whether this story became reconciliation or reckoning. The executive review began quietly. No headlines, no press releases. Just structured emails, scheduled interviews, sealed reports, and an independent compliance team Henry Caldwell recommended from outside the state. If Julian was going to face evaluation, it would be impartial. I did not step into his office. I did not walk through the building. I did not hover over decisions. Shared oversight does not mean interference. It means visibility. The first week passed without incident. Investors were calm. The board was cooperative. Victoria shifted into what I recognized as damage containment mode, polished statements, carefully curated social media posts about organizational evolution and transparent leadership. She was talented at reframing narrative. But narrative does not change numbers. On the 10th day Henry called, his voice was steady as always. Preliminary culture findings are concerning, he said. I did not interrupt. Silence invites clarity. Employee retention in senior project management is significantly lower than industry average. Exit interviews cite volatility in executive communication. I closed my eyes briefly. Volatility. Clarify, I said gently. Public praise, private intimidation, rapid reversals in directive strategy, decision shifts tied to investor optics rather than operational stability. Daniel, sitting across from me at the dining table, looked up when he saw my expression change. I put Henry on speaker. Is there evidence of misconduct? I asked. No criminal exposure, Henry replied, but structural instability tied to leadership temperament. That word landed heavier than any legal accusation would have. When we ended the call, Daniel exhaled slowly. He built fast, Daniel said. Fast things crack. I nodded. Robert used to say that growth without grounding collapses inward. Julian had expanded aggressively over the last 5 years, new developments, ambitious acquisitions, public visibility. But growth built on image pressure can suffocate the people inside it. 2 days later, the auditors requested a private call with Julian, the board, and trustee authority, me. I joined remotely. The screen divided into small rectangles. Board members serious and reserved, Henry composed, Julian upright but tense. Victoria was not present. We've completed the first phase of leadership assessment, the lead auditor began. Financial governance remains compliant. However, executive behavioral consistency presents material risk. Julian's jaw tightened. Define material, he said evenly. The auditor did not flinch. High turnover among senior staff. Reputational vulnerability tied to public image management overriding internal communication transparency. Reported culture of conditional loyalty. Conditional loyalty. I watched Julian absorb that. His eyes flickered, defensive, then reflective. Are you suggesting I'm unfit? He asked. We are suggesting adjustment is necessary, the auditor replied. The board chair cleared his throat. Julian, your performance metrics are strong. But stability requires internal confidence. Silence filled the digital room. I did not speak. This was his moment, not mine. Finally, Julian looked directly into the camera toward me. And if I commit to restructuring leadership processes? He asked. The auditor nodded. Then phase transition can proceed as outlined in the trust. The trust. The document he once dismissed as symbolic, now it was anchor and mirror both. After the meeting ended, my phone rang almost immediately. Julian, I answered without delay. You heard everything, he said quietly. Yes. A pause. They think I'm unstable. They think you're reactive, I corrected. Those are different, he exhaled sharply. You're enjoying this. No, I said honestly. I'm relieved it isn't worse. That surprised him. You thought it would be worse? I let a small breath pass through me. I prepared for worse. Silence again, but not hostile, not brittle, thinking silence. Why didn't you tell me, he asked. Tell you what? That I was becoming this. I considered that carefully. Because this was no longer about clauses or control. This was about self-awareness. I tried, I said gently. Several times you called it criticism. He didn't argue. He remembered the dinner where I suggested he slow expansion. The phone call where I asked about staff departures. The moment he dismissed my concern as old-school caution. Victoria says perception drives confidence, he murmured. Perception without substance erodes confidence, I replied. Daniel stepped into the room quietly but didn't interrupt. He has a gift for presence without intrusion. If I agree to leadership coaching, Julian continued slowly, and restructure management communication, will the transition timeline hold? Yes, I said firmly. I honor agreements. Another pause, and if I fail, that was the question beneath everything. I didn't soften my answer. Then the board appoints interim leadership. He swallowed audibly. You would let that happen? If necessary, I said calmly. I love you, but love does not override consequence. The words hung between us, heavy, honest. For the first time in this entire process, his voice lost its sharp edges. Dad would be disappointed, he whispered. That pierced differently. I looked toward Robert's photograph on the bookshelf. Your father would be firm, I replied. Not disappointed, firm. Julian breathed slowly. I built everything so people would respect me. Respect is earned internally before it's granted externally, I said. If the people inside your company don't trust your steadiness, investors eventually won't either. He didn't respond immediately. I heard movement on his end, perhaps pacing, perhaps sitting down heavily. I don't know how to lead without pressure, he admitted. There it was. The root, not arrogance, fear of losing relevance, fear of not being enough. Daniel met my eyes across the room. He could sense the shift, too. Pressure is not leadership, I said gently. Pressure is urgency, leadership is consistency. Silence again, but softer now. I'll hire the coach, he said finally. And restructure reporting? Good. And I'll issue an internal statement acknowledging the review. That mattered more than he realized. Public humility inside the company would signal real change. That's wise, I replied. He hesitated before speaking again. Mom, about the sign. My breath paused. Yes, it was cruel. The words were quiet, almost fragile. Yes, I said simply. He didn't defend it, he didn't justify it. He just let the acknowledgement sit between us. That was new. I didn't realize how small it made me look, he added softly. Not you, me. I closed my eyes briefly. Growth begins with recognition. Then learn from it, I said. We ended the call without tension, not warm, not reconciled, but different. That evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch again. The sky was streaked in soft violet and amber. He's changing, Daniel observed. He's considering, I corrected. Change requires repetition, but consideration is the first crack in pride. You didn't break him, Daniel said quietly. No, I replied. I removed the illusion. And illusions, once gone, do not return easily. 2 weeks remained in the review period. The auditors would compile their final assessment. The board would vote on phased authority reinstatement. And Julian would either solidify his leadership through humility or reveal that image still mattered more than substance. Inside the company, rumors were settling. Staff meetings had shifted tone. Communication slowed, more deliberate. Victoria's public messaging softened, focusing on family governance legacy instead of individual triumph. She was adapting. But I sensed something else brewing beneath the surface. Because while Julian was adjusting internally, someone else was recalculating externally. And when recalculations happen in marriages built on perception, the results are rarely predictable. The final week of the executive review did not feel dramatic. There were no raised voices, no public confrontations, no headlines, but the quiet felt heavier than conflict. Because quiet, when layered with awareness, forces reflection. Julian had begun leadership coaching twice a week. The board sent me progress summaries, measured professional updates, improved delegation tone, reduced directive volatility, structured internal feedback loop initiated. On paper, it looked promising. But growth on paper and growth in character are not the same thing. One evening, Henry Caldwell called again. His voice carried that subtle shift I had learned to recognize over decades, when something isn't wrong, but it isn't stable either. There's been movement within the executive compensation structure, he said. I leaned back in my chair. Daniel looked up from the newspaper. Clarify, I responded calmly. Victoria requested access to certain discretionary brand development funds tied to marketing expansion. The amounts are significant. Was the request within governance parameters? I asked. Technically, yes, Henry replied. But timing is strategic. Strategic, a word that can mean intelligent or opportunistic depending on context. Define the amounts, I said. He gave me the number. It was large enough to signal repositioning, not illegal. Not improper, but defensive. Daniel folded his paper slowly. He understood money in a different way, earned through labor, not leveraged through optics. She's securing her footing, he said quietly after the call ended. I nodded. Or preparing for instability. Because when reputation-driven partnerships sense uncertainty, they do not cling, they hedge. The next morning, Julian called before 8 a.m. His tone was tight, controlled. Did Henry speak to you? He asked. Yes. A pause. Victoria says brand positioning must remain aggressive during internal review. And what do you say? I asked. I say optics matter. There it was again, the old reflex. Julian, I said evenly, confidence does not require spectacle. He exhaled sharply. You don't understand how fast perception shifts in development markets. I understand governance risk, I replied. And emotional overcompensation creates it. Silence. But this silence wasn't defensive, it was strained. She thinks you're undermining me, he admitted finally. I am stabilizing structure, I corrected. If stabilization feels like undermining, then perhaps the structure wasn't steady. He didn't argue, instead he asked something unexpected. Do you trust her? The question lingered between us. Not about love, not about marriage. About alignment. I think Victoria trusts strength, I answered carefully. The question is what she defines as strength. He absorbed that, because he knew. Strength to Victoria meant forward motion, visible dominance, curated success. Strength to me meant durability under pressure. Those definitions do not always coexist peacefully. That afternoon, Victoria requested a private meeting, not in a cafe this time. In my home, that alone told me something. She arrived without excess, simple navy dress, minimal jewelry, composed but less theatrical. Daniel greeted her warmly as he greets everyone. Grounded men unsettle performative ones. We sat at the dining table, no posturing. No raised voices. I need clarity, she began directly. Are you planning to permanently dilute Julian's authority? I folded my hands. No. She studied my face, searching for hesitation. There was none. Then why maintain oversight beyond the review period? She pressed. Because behavioral patterns do not dissolve in 30 days, I replied calmly. They evolve through repetition. Her jaw tightened slightly. You don't think he's capable? I think he's capable of growth, I said. If growth is chosen consistently. She leaned forward. You've always doubted him. That accusation didn't sting. It revealed more about her fear than my belief. I questioned his pace, I answered, not his intelligence. A silence stretched between us. Victoria rarely sat in silence comfortably. You humiliated him, she said quietly. The trust clause humiliated him. Accountability is not humiliation, I replied. Public disrespect is. She didn't respond immediately because she remembered the sign, the message, the photo taped to the door. That was a mistake, she admitted softly. That was new. I watched her carefully. It was more than a mistake, I said gently. It revealed insecurity. Her composure wavered for just a second. You don't know what it's like, she said, voice lower now, Being judged constantly, being evaluated on appearance, brand, connections. I tilted my head slightly. I was a compliance officer for 30 years. My decisions were audited quarterly. She looked almost surprised. Perhaps she had mistaken my quiet for fragility. Julian fears losing relevance, she said, and when he fears that, he reacts. Then he must learn to lead without fear, I replied. Because fear-based leadership destroys trust. She looked toward the window briefly. If this review fails, she began. It hasn't failed, I interrupted. It's revealing. She looked back at me. And if the board shifts permanently, there it was, not about Julian's character, about position, about influence. Then the board does what protects the company, I said steadily. And you, she asked. I protect my son from becoming someone he can't respect in 10 years. The room grew very quiet. Victoria's shoulders softened slightly, not defeated, reflective. You really believe this will make him stronger, she said. If he allows it, I answered. She stood after a long pause. He doesn't see it yet. He doesn't have to see it, I said. He has to endure it. After she left, Daniel sat across from me, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She's afraid, he observed. Yes. Of losing status, of losing control of narrative. Daniel nodded slowly. Narratives don't keep roofs from collapsing. I smiled faintly. That's why I married him. 2 days later, the auditors delivered their final report. Financial governance, compliant. Structural leadership risk, moderate but improving. Recommendation, phased authority reinstatement with quarterly oversight continuation for 18 months. The board voted unanimously in favor. Authority would return incrementally, but oversight would remain, not punishment, protection. That evening, Julian called. His voice was steadier than I expected. It's done, he said. Yes, 18 months. Yes, a pause. I accepted it without argument. That mattered. Good, I replied softly. Victoria isn't pleased, he admitted. She thinks it signals weakness publicly. Does it? I asked. Silence. Then no, growth often sounds like that, shorter answers, less defensiveness. Mom, he said after a moment, if I had refused, what would you have done? I didn't soften the truth. I would have supported the board. He exhaled slowly. I know, and for the first time, that knowledge didn't create hostility, it created respect. When the call ended, I walked into the hallway and paused in front of Robert's photograph. He's learning, I whispered softly. The following morning, markets reacted mildly but steadily positive. Investors interpreted the structured oversight as responsible governance, not instability. Victoria posted a carefully worded statement about multi-generational stewardship and strengthened corporate ethics. She was adapting again. But adaptation under pressure reveals truth over time. Because in 18 months, when oversight fades fully, Julian will stand on his own, not on illusion, not on image, but on consistency. The real question now is not whether he can rebuild authority. It is whether he can rebuild trust within his marriage. Because while leadership can be coached, insecurity inside partnership can fracture silently. And fractures, if ignored, widen. 3 months into the 18-month oversight period, something subtle began to shift. Not in the boardroom, not in the financial statements. In the marriage, I didn't hear it from gossip. I heard it in Julian's voice, shorter responses, longer pauses, a certain tightness that no executive coaching could smooth out. Growth in leadership was happening, but growth at home, that is more fragile. One evening, close to 9, Julian called unexpectedly. His tone wasn't angry, it was tired. Are you busy? He asked. I glanced at Daniel, who was sanding down a small wooden jewelry box he'd been restoring. No, I said gently. What happened? A long exhale. Victoria thinks I've become smaller. I didn't respond immediately. Silence invites honesty. She says I used to command rooms, he continued. Now I negotiate my own authority. I almost smiled at the phrasing. That sounded like Victoria. And how do you feel? I asked. Another pause. Calmer, he admitted. But she says calm doesn't inspire dominance. There it was. The fracture. I leaned back in my chair. Dominance is loud, I said. Confidence is steady. She says investors are drawn to certainty. Certainty does not require volume. He didn't argue. Instead, he said something that told me the real tension. She asked if I resented you. That question hung between us. And do you? I asked softly. Silence. not defensive, searching. No, he said finally, I resented being exposed. But not you, that was progress. But exposure changes relationship dynamics. Victoria had built her brand around the image of unstoppable ascent. Oversight introduced humility. Humility doesn't photograph as well. 2 weeks later, Henry called me again, not about governance, about something more delicate. There's movement in their personal financial restructuring, he said carefully. Victoria requested independent asset counsel. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. Separate representation? Yes. Daniel looked up when he saw my expression change. Preemptive positioning? I asked. Henry paused. Possibly, that word carries weight. Because in marriages where power shifts, protection instincts activate quickly. That evening, I didn't wait for Julian to call. I called him. He answered on the second ring. Are you separating finances? I asked directly. Silence on the other end. Then she requested it. Do you agree? Another pause. I don't know. His voice carried something new now, not ego, uncertainty. Julian, I said carefully, restructuring marital assets during corporate oversight sends a signal. To who? To everyone. He was quiet for a long moment. She says she needs security. From what? I asked gently. That question matters. From instability, he said, from being attached to any future governance fallout. I closed my eyes briefly. So that was it, not fear of him, fear of proximity to vulnerability. And do you see oversight as instability? I asked. No, he said, I see it as correction. Correction, that word mattered. Then ask yourself why she doesn't. He didn't respond immediately. Because sometimes clarity doesn't feel comforting, it feels threatening. 2 days later, Victoria called me directly. No formalities, no polished introduction. I assume you've spoken to Julian, she began. Yes, then you understand my concern. I understand your strategy, I corrected gently, a tight breath on the other end. This isn't strategy, it's protection. Protection from what? I asked. Silence. Then, from being tied to a leadership trajectory that's uncertain. There it was, not love, not partnership, trajectory. Marriage isn't an investment vehicle, I said quietly. It's alignment. Alignment requires stability, she replied sharply. And you destabilized him? I let that sit, because reaction would only confirm her framing. If his stability depends on public dominance, I said calmly, then it was never stable. Her voice dropped lower. You've always viewed me as superficial. No, I replied. I view you as strategic. The question is what you're optimizing for. Silence. Because optimization reveals priority. I married Julian because I believed in his potential, she said finally. And now, I asked softly, another long pause. Now I'm evaluating risk. That honesty surprised me, cold but honest. Then you need to decide, I said gently, whether you married potential or character. She ended the call shortly after, not angrily, but unresolved. That night, Daniel sat beside me on the porch. The air was cool, the sky quiet. She's recalculating, he said softly. Yes. And him? I looked toward the horizon. He's realizing leadership isn't the only thing that requires humility. The following week, Julian requested dinner, not at a restaurant. At our house, that in itself was new. He arrived alone. No Victoria, no entourage of curated presence, just him. He looked thinner, not physically weaker, just worn. Daniel greeted him warmly, as always, no tension. No subtle reminders of status, just steady hospitality. We sat at the table where Robert once explained layered asset protection years ago. Life has symmetry sometimes. Halfway through dinner, Julian set his fork down. She's considering separation, he said quietly. Daniel didn't react. I didn't either. Silence gives room for courage. She says she didn't sign up for governance uncertainty, he continued. She signed up for acceleration. And what did you sign up for? I asked. He swallowed. Partnership. That word trembled slightly. Then ask yourself if partnership depends on perpetual expansion, I said softly, or on shared endurance. He looked down at his plate. I built everything fast, he admitted, so no one would see me hesitate. There it was. The insecurity he once masked with arrogance. Strength isn't speed, I said, it's sustainability. He nodded slowly. If she leaves, he said quietly, people will think it's because of oversight. People think many things, Daniel said gently. But you'll know the truth. Julian looked at Daniel then, really looked at him, for the first time without dismissal. You don't care what people think, Julian observed. Daniel smiled faintly. I care what I build. That landed deeper than any lecture could. Before Julian left, he paused near the door. Mom, he said softly, if she files for separation, the media will spin it as corporate instability. Then let them, I replied calmly. Your life is not a press release. He studied my face carefully, searching for fear. There was none, because oversight doesn't frighten me, truth doesn't frighten me, only self-deception does. 2 weeks later, the filing became official. Private, no dramatic public statements, just legal paperwork citing strategic divergence. The phrasing almost made me sigh. Investors reacted mildly. The company remained stable, governance steady, no collapse, no scandal. Just adjustment, and Julian, he didn't rage, he didn't spiral, he showed up to work, he attended coaching. He reduced discretionary marketing spend voluntarily, he met with senior managers individually, quietly, consistently. And for the first time in his career, internal trust metrics rose not because of spectacle, because of steadiness. Victoria moved out within a month, no public feud, no explosive confrontation. Just separation built on incompatible definitions of strength. One evening, as I closed my office files, Julian called again. His voice was different now, not broken, not proud, clear. I thought losing authority would be the worst thing, he said quietly. It wasn't. I waited. Losing illusion was, he finished. I felt something settle inside me then, because that sentence meant growth, real growth. And now, I asked. A small breath. Now I'm building something slower. Silence. Then he added almost gently, thank you. Not dramatic, not tearful, just sincere. After we hung up, Daniel wrapped his arm around my shoulders. You didn't save him, he said softly. No, I replied. He saved himself. I just refused to let him collapse comfortably. The oversight period still had 15 months left. The company would continue under structured governance. Julian would continue rebuilding internally and externally. But something more important had shifted. He no longer equated dominance with worth. And Victoria's departure, painful as it was, had revealed something even clearer. Image can leave when performance falters. Character stays. The real question now is not whether Julian can maintain corporate stability. It's whether, without the pressure of constant performance, he can finally become the kind of man who doesn't need applause to feel secure. And that transformation is still unfolding. Months passed more quietly than anyone expected. No scandals, no dramatic board interventions, no emergency investor meetings, just steady reports, measured growth, and something far more valuable than expansion: consistency. The quarterly oversight meetings became routine rather than tense. Henry would send structured summaries. Leadership volatility reduced. Executive turnover stabilized. Internal confidence index increased. Numbers don't lie when they're measured honestly. One afternoon, near the end of the final oversight quarter, Henry came to the house in person. That alone told me the moment mattered. Daniel greeted him warmly and left us at the dining table, the same table where Robert once sketched out.